try to stuff their resumes with all of those modules and those expertise. But in your case, you're like student, and student is just for institutions.
I don't feel like I'm limited to Workday Student. Again, I look at his whole school's technology stack.
I think you've taken career transition to a whole other level. You started in a completely different field and now you're independent. It's like day and night. Hey, Kristina, happy to have you here. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for accepting to be on Ask an Expert. You're actually my fourth guest, so I'm getting a little bit better. But bear with me if I'm asking too many questions or if I talk too fast. But appreciate you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
For the ones who don't know you, Kristina, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started.
Sure. So, yeah, my name is Kristina Kelpe. I have been in the Workday Student ecosystem for over 5 years now. I've spent most of my career working in higher education. I was a political science and English major and got my master's in political science. Thought I was going to be a faculty member when I happened to work in the Career Center and saw all these PhD students at the University of Chicago struggling to get jobs. And I thought, well, if an economics PhD student at University of Chicago struggling to get a job, then maybe that's that. I'm not a very risk adverse person, which is interesting how I ended up being an independent consultant later on. But that I wanted something a little bit more stable. I really liked living in urban areas, and that's also very hard to get as a faculty member. So I started just a career in higher ed, and I thought I'd move around in different offices. It was kind of unique because a lot of people set out and they're like, I'm going to work in career services and I'll work my way up. And I just thought, I'm going to just want to work in higher ed. For my very first job, within a few months, the IT person that was embedded in our department came and said, come work with me. And I thought, I
Nice.
literally said, I'm like, I'm not qualified. I can't. He's like, you get systems. Like, no problem. I'll train you. But it was this qualification piece that kind of like hung me up, even though I was like, I kind of think I would like it, but I enjoyed my job I had. I wasn't really ready to make a change. That was my very first job. And then just opportunities kept coming along in life where people kept saying, work on this implementation, do this. And I was asked to join a team, that did data and the operations piece of it and the analytics. And it took about 10 more years, but I finally said yes. And then I've had great mentors along the way. I still kept doing implementations and at colleges. And then finally, when Workday Student was being implemented at my school, I was like, oh, this is a career. Because a lot of times in higher ed, in order to work on an implementation, you had to work for the vendor.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to move to wherever they were. And I just didn't really want to get up and move. I really liked living in Southern California, and that's where I wanted to be. But when I saw these Workday consultants that kind of lived all over the United States and could do this, I thought, well, maybe that's an opportunity. I also read articles by like Moran Technology Consulting saying nearly every institution was going to have to change their student information system. Workday Student was the first one to be in the cloud. And it's just, that's what schools need. They need to be in the cloud. They don't want on-prem systems. And Workday's been leading the charge in that area. So for me, it was this opportunity. Then I made the leap into consulting. I've never looked back. It's been an amazing ecosystem. So many incredible people that I've met that have mentored me along the way. And I try to give back to it myself.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what caught my eye when we first talked a few months ago. I think you've taken career transition to a whole other level because you started in a completely different field and now you're independent. It's like day and night, right? Tell me more about those small steps, because you didn't just started in faculty and then you became independent, right? There was few steps, and you said that you're not very risk averse. So what were the exact steps that you took, right? Like step by step before becoming independent today?
So I worked at an implementation partner, and I was a functional consultant there. So, and I will say, in my experience, higher education, I worked at small schools. We didn't have project managers. I just did everything of it. I organized okay, we need to move. Let's map out the plan. Okay, we're going to do this week by week. And then I did the actual implementation of it. And that was a big shift for me when I came to the implementation partners. I were these separate project managers and the functional consultants. And so when I was in that, I would say there was a little bit of a struggle for me because to me, it's hard to separate out and not think about the whole thing. But when that's someone's job to be the project manager and to run that, to kind of just say, well, let them do it on their own and their way of going about it. But I got so much knowledge by doing the hands-on functional work. I think that was critical to start on that path, to get to know Workday Student really in and out, to bring a school live on Workday Student. There's these different work streams within Workday Student. It's a lot. And I think a lot of people don't realize it. And if it's like just like HCM, you can't
Me
be
the
just an
first.
HCM. Yeah, it's like there's academic foundation, these all align with Workday product lines. These are not necessarily offices on a campus. There is
Hmm.
financial aid, which that is an office, but then there's things like academic foundation. That's not an office. It's just a Workday product line. It involves a lot of different offices on campus. So I was a functional consultant. I went back to work on the client side back at the institutions that I'd spent most of my career. Their project manager had left, and I had realized, I was like, maybe I could have more influence on the project by being a project manager
Hmm.
and being able to coordinate. So I was the senior project manager until, unfortunately, there was just a change in the product direction, and so that project stopped. I kind of was I really wanted to continue to work client side, and I just couldn't make the opportunities kind of come about. And it was something where it's like I needed to find another job because that project had ended. So I
Yeah.
went and worked at another implementation partner as a senior project manager. And it wasn't quite the fit. It was still just this part where the implementation partner has a certain role. And I don't think that's fully understood. But I think, especially coming from higher on the client side, understanding, they've got a contract they need to execute.
Hmm.
And that's what they're going to do. They have a methodology that they're going to follow, all to reduce risk. These are businesses here to make money. This is their formula, and it's really hard to kind of work outside of that in that creative kind of way. I
Yeah.
happened to have this opportunity come up to go independent, or I could have gone and worked at another firm that I'd really respected and thought maybe that was going to be the right fit. But it was about 12 years ago that I was kind of going through some tough things in life, and I wrote down like what are my goals and things, and one of them was to own my own business. And I had this
Nice.
wonderful mentor who came to me when this independent opportunity came up, and when I was kind of wavering, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, there's the salary and the benefits, and like, what if I don't find work? But I was like, I did kind of write down this goal to own my own business. She's like, then why are you even thinking about this? You should do it. And so I was
I
like,
love
you're
that.
right. I'll just
I
go
think,
for it, and I've never looked back.
yeah, what you just said, I think I relate to it so much. And so many people have this exact experience where, they're attached to their job. Some, they love it, some they don't. But everyone thinks about like a steady salary and all of the benefits, etc. And, they're thinking about making the leap. And for you, according to what you just said, you had that goal in mind 10 years ago, and then you were finally able to achieve it.
Yeah, and I will always say throughout my entire career, it's so many people that are mentoring, encouraging. I think that piece where people can see into you and say we see things that you don't even sometimes see in yourself, and it's always important to listen to those
Yeah.
people and the things that stand out. Because sometimes and I even when I worked with students and would advise them, you want to have this identity. There's who you want to be, and then there's what you actually are good at. And so how do you sometimes it's those outside people that can really see this is what you're really good at. And the more that we all lean into our strengths and utilize that, I think all the better. So, and it's just like finding that right fit in the Workday ecosystem. There's so many different kinds of roles, from functional side to technical side to client side, to this independent space.
Hmm.
And finding that right fit that is like, yes, because as an independent, people don't care if I do some project management work, if I do, some functional work, they're like, this is great. So that can be embraced in a way that just didn't necessarily work in kind of the traditional partner ecosystem.
Well, I think you've done a good job at it, because I think the first time that I've discovered you on LinkedIn was because of Student and because of the interesting angles that you're sharing, on a weekly basis. I think you're first of all, I don't know a lot of Workday Student. By the way, ever since I talked to you, like somehow I met two or three other Workday Student consultants. So it's crazy, but you were the first one, but you're the only one sharing those tips and content. What's the motivation behind it?
I think it goes back to that mentorship that I've had. And I appreciate, I think on the HCM and finance, you're right. I don't see a lot of student people, but there's so many on the HCM and finance, and I get so many tips from them. And it's amazing how
Mm,
many times when I post something, someone from HCM or finance will say, oh, this works the same. And when I see their post, it's like, oh, this works the same. There's so much that I can take. And I just believe in information sharing in higher education. And I will say a lot of people in higher ed, they have listservs and things, and that's how they share. And maybe that was I think there's a drive to try to do this within community. And I know
hmm.
that community is getting revamped for Workday, but it's
Yeah.
hard to still have those same like personal conversations or just like, again, the tips I have are more strategy and it's less technical. That was also this kind of gap I felt like on the partner side and in this way that looking very high level across the different aspects, people just have different views, and so it was a view that I felt was kind of missing, but I was encouraged by the other people that would post and the positive feedback that they got. Keith the Kofer was one of the first that I found, and seeing these things and seeing the reactions, I'm like, well, people find these helpful. I
Yeah.
constantly have thoughts on my mind. And it was it's sort of become like a dear diary of things that I just write down of like by week of, this is just something that was meaningful to me and maybe it is to someone else. And
It
again,
is.
that ecosystem piece of Workday of how much consultants and not just like just everyone looks to help each other. And so everyone just saying, this is what I can contribute. I don't do the technical details that some of the other people do. And I love when they provide that. I'm like, okay, I'm going to save this post and come back to this for when I might need it. But there's other things that I see on a strategic level that I try to share to help others along in their journey.
Yeah, and it seems like those are the two types of content that I see on LinkedIn on about Workday. It's either strategy leadership or configuration technical. I think on you're more on the leadership and strategy side, and it appeals to a lot of people, especially at the beginning of project and how to, you know, take that project to the very end successfully. And I feel like everything that you're sharing is the result of all of these years working, you know, with partners, also with clients. But just to go back a little bit, because for me it's like phenomenal that you came from, you know, career services faculty and then you somehow became project manager and functional consultant. Most people are afraid of becoming consultants. They don't have the training or whatever. What was that transition like? Like, how did you gain those skills of project management and consulting, right, from your background?
I will say that there's a good part that just kind of comes naturally to me. So I'm not PMP
Nice, I love that.
certified.
Natural
Maybe other
talent.
things I can actually. So, from working in career services for so long, I'd talk to these super talented people who graduated from the institution that I worked at and say, so how did this degree help you? And they're like, oh, it didn't. And I don't
Yeah.
think they were correct in that statement. I think the problem solving, the analytical, it might not have been the content in there, but it's the skills. And I do think there was skills, there was things going back to my master's work where um, at University of Chicago where it was hard to keep up with the content. There were so many books to read and I was spending all this time. I was so stressed out. And I think it was until my second quarter when a faculty member finally said, oh yeah, you weren't supposed to be able to read all of the content if you could. We didn't give you enough. It's to help you sort through it. And I think it's those kinds of things and being in some of those challenging environments that gave me that confidence. But again, so many mentors, so many people that just took me on. They're like, let me help you understand this. And so being inquisitive for those people that see something in you, learn from them, ask the questions. I think if just more people ask the questions, I think that's
Hmm.
one thing that I do that a lot of people don't. I cringe when people say, "Oh, this is probably a stupid question I'll ask." And I'm like, "No, because
Just ask it.
I 100% of the time it's a great question and it's diminishing. And the more that you say my questions are valid and I should ask, and it probably will help someone else out. And you do have to be willing to kind of put yourself out there. But it was when I was at the first implementation partner, I asked so many questions and I'd ask them in really broad environments, company meetings, because I was just like, this doesn't quite make sense. And I want to understand, I want to do a good job with this. And I'd ask the question, and I'd have all these people slacking me on the side saying, thank you so much for asking. Like, I was wondering that too. And so I think if more people
Yes.
just start to ask questions, then you start to put the pieces together. Um, just believe in
Yeah.
yourself a little bit more.
You repeated multiple times that you had, all of these mentors who pushed you and who helped you. How did you find those mentors? I get this question a lot.
I think I there was a bit of luck of like I ended up working at really good institutions, but I would say there's a little bit of like an assessing an organization and their culture and the kinds of people.
Okay.
One big shift when I came to consulting, like when went through interviews with partners, is that they'd be less than 2 hours, and I thought that's crazy because in higher
Hmm.
ed in the schools I worked at, you would have sometimes 8 to maybe 15 hours of an interview for a job. And
No
people are
way.
just like,
Really?
wow, that's nuts. But to me, it's about making sure there's that culture fit, making sure there's that fit within the team. People in higher ed can sometimes stay a long time. And when you get that
Yeah,
fit
true.
within the team, it clicks. And you start to realize that I'm like, how do I find these mentors? I'm like, there were some very talented people at the organization. I think those that you see speak up in meetings. So especially when you're more junior, see who's
Yeah.
asking these things, who's working on stuff, just ask to meet with them. I guess also in career services, there's this constant thing we teach around informational interviews and
Mm,
networking. And so even as an introvert, which I definitely am, and it pushed myself out there to do this, but I did know I wanted to move up. So I'd force, just to do these meetings and to learn from people and ask the questions. And I think a lot of times when you just ask thoughtful questions, people are like, oh, yeah, like let me teach you more. People are passionate about what they do and they want to help others along more often than what we think that they might be willing
yeah.
to do.
No, I totally agree. I think in my first ever Workday job, we had this system of a buddy, and your buddy would be your mentor or your coach. I think that was a great system, and I think many companies have this system. So that's free mentor for you, pretty easy. And then the informational interview is very interesting that you mentioned that. A few years ago, when I was sharing content more on the job search side, I was doing a lot of research about that. And yes, you can just reach out to people you admire or people maybe one or two steps ahead of you, and then just ask for an informational interview where you just ask about their job or their careers, and just like you said, people are passionate about what they do, and they just love talking about themselves, and it's just free advice at that point.
Absolutely. I will say one more thing of so I had people in the IT department that would teach me things or someone in reporting. And so the first time that I'm like inner join, outer join, I'm like, can you help me understand this? And they're getting out the whiteboard, okay, yeah, let's draw this out. Um, of saying, okay, a data warehouse and ETL, and I'm like, what's ETL? And and just continuing asking the questions there, they'll keep explaining it, and you have to just keep asking, writing it down. I think just a simple thing that also can help people learn that I don't always see is like, so what I hear you saying is, because they're
Mhm.
afraid maybe I didn't get this right. But if you're not walking away with the right, information, then, you might be missing this opportunity to learn from someone else, the wisdom that they have so that you can apply it to your own life.
Yeah, love that. um, Going a little bit more on the student side of things, I am a complete rookie. As you know, I'm more on the HCM side. I'd love to dive deeper into your student experience, and I think a lot of people would benefit from that, especially, as you said, higher ed organizations and institutions. Uh, but just before then, just as an introduction, I know that you've, founded your own company, you have your own branding. Not every independent does that, and I want to know your thought process before putting yourself out there, having a brand, etc., and not just a contractor getting contracts. What was your thought process behind it?
Yeah, it was something when I went independent, like I'd mentioned, I was very nervous about it, of like, will I continue to find work? Projects can stop on a dime, and I'd experienced that, multiple times. They can shut down quickly and to make sure I had work to do. But what I was shocked was, especially when I started out in 2022, was how frequently I was getting contacted about jobs.
Hmm.
And I mean, it was for a while, it was like 2, 3 times a week that I was hearing about opportunities. And I was just blown away of all the resources that were sort of needed out there. And I knew not a lot of other people would maybe be willing to take that risk to independent.
Yeah.
But I could see, and was working with some other independent consultants on a project, and there's something about the magic of working together. And before I'd gone independent, I talked to someone that had, and I think they were working pretty siloed on a project. They were like the one independent consultant. I think that can be a tough situation,
Yeah.
potentially if you're not on campus and you could feel isolated. And that was definitely a concern of mine because I do like working within a team. I think bringing in multiple ideas is the way to get to the best perspective. So it was just something where I could see this team impact, and I thought, okay, like what could I do? So I did go work for another company for a while that was like, hey, we'll help give you the infrastructure into like we can bring on salaried people. But it was just ultimately it was like, do you know what? I had a vision of how I wanted to do this. And within
Hmm.
my like being values driven is so important to me, and just kind of acknowledging again that's who I am. So I'm just going to live into it. I'm going to live into that as a strength. And I found some people that were part time that maybe that had been in higher education that I'd worked with before. And I really came to them and said, if I let you work whatever hours you want, when you want, and I'll teach you, like, will you come work with me? And they said yes.
What a good offer.
Because I knew they were super talented and I knew we already aligned with values. And so when they started
Yeah.
to work with me, and that's how I could scale a little bit more and have more impact. Because ultimately, I'm passionate about schools being successful with Workday Student. I do think it's like I see schools do it on their own, but I think it can go a lot better if you do have some independence. Some do have some people that really know what they're doing, that have kind of, they know what you don't know, that can help guide you in that expertise way. And so this is where I took that kind of, I was started as Kelpe Consulting, still my company's legal name, but rebranded it because I didn't want it to be about me. Again, for me, it
Yeah.
is about the team and it's a group. And I don't want to say Kristina did this. I wanted it to be a larger thing that more people could be part of. I don't have specific goals of like what my company will end up being. A lot of it is like, well, what's the need out there? And I'm
Yeah.
trying to respond to that. Work life balance is important to me. So there's a little bit of like, if I can do what I enjoy doing and helping others, and I can live within my values and work the hours that I want, then I'll just keep doing this and we'll just see how it evolves.
Yeah. How did you come up with Legato as a name?
So it was hard because there's so many good names out there that I'm like, oh, that's a great name. And it was something where I was trying to like launch and kind of be ready for Workday Rising.
Yeah.
So there's a few things. I'm like, so I chose legato. It's a musical term of like flowing together. And for me, that's what I like to see with for Workday Student when things flow together.
Hmm.
That's what my team and we come in to do to kind of patch up whatever things are not working well in the process, and so that you really get the value of the impact and the impact of Workday Student. We kind of I talked with someone yesterday that said this is very similar in HCM, that you get the implementation and then some other consultants come behind afterwards and they kind of get it to that next level, that minimum viable
Yeah.
product to like really maximize like the investment. Everything that you saw on the sales pitch often requires or I think can benefit from in many situations an independent consultant. So we make that smooth piece to it. I'm also just obsessed with Italy. It's an Italian term. And so that was also something that appealed to me, but it was the meaning behind it. Gosh, there's so many things about like trying to find terms that aren't used and that's easy to spell, like all these things that it's, I think, more difficult than it seems to
Yeah.
create a name.
Yeah, because you want to, keep that brand and that name for a long time. So I think you should spend a little bit of time on it for sure. Side question on something that you just said. You said that many institutions, they would benefit from having independent consultants, helping during the implementation and even after. Have you seen institutions hire internal HRIS analysts or Workday consultants internally and keeping them for years? Have you seen that or not really on the institution side?
I more and more are starting to hire their own. It's not HRIS, but kind of like student analysts, but they are doing more of this. And when instead of the thought, I think when Workday Student was started at my institution, and I think it's still often recommended is to backfill.
Okay.
I think there should be some level of backfill, but I really encourage people to future fill and say Workday is a very different model than their legacy systems. The legacy systems that schools are on from these student information systems is you really have them run by IT. There's lots of coding. It's very technical exercise. And Workday is what I call like a techno-functional system. So you need different kinds of staff. Now, some of those people could transition, but there's also going to be this period that you need them to keep up with the legacy system because it's so old that, only they kind of know how to do it. It makes no sense to like move them into this. So saying, bring in people that, and I think the institution should do this, bring in their own internal resources, but the people that are going to do a lot of the testing, a lot of the
Yeah.
like data validation, they're kind of business analyst roles, which really haven't existed for the most part in higher education, a little bit within the HR and finance office at institutions, but not within like a registrar office. I would say very few have had that role. You're going to need that for Workday Student, but even more if you have someone that's already been through this that could guide that person. Because I think if you just hired a business analyst, I think it would be hard for them to know exactly what to do in the project.
Yeah.
And so maximizing an experienced independent person that's been through this that can guide them so that they're learning along the way, because you only get so much time with the implementation partner. Their role is also being an implementation partner, not necessarily like how are you going to function day to day and build out
Guidance.
like your operations guide.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, now I get it. Yeah, if they're looking for that experience and that guidance, I think it doesn't really make sense to hire someone internally because they'll be there for the project only. So okay, that makes sense of what you just said. That's perfect. Going back to Legato, um, and diving a little bit deeper into the student implementations, you've said that you not disagree, but you have a different approach than most partners. I'd love to hear more about it because I think though all of the boutique firms that are emerging, they are different than those big companies, the big partners, and they're offering a more customized, personalized service, and that's what clients love, especially after the main go live. So I'd love to hear your approach on it.
Yeah, so implementation partners really have a list of configuration tasks. You've got the tasks in the system, you've got the BPs, you've got the security. You're going through a checklist of activities. But that assumes that all those activities will meet the operations of the institution, which
Yeah,
isn't necessarily true.
it's
That's a
copy
big
pasted.
assumption.
Yeah.
Yeah, of saying, and in the Workday student ecosystem, there is this piece in the methodology that Workday calls the customer readiness review or the CRR, but I have yet to see it really maximized in the way it should be. And it is on the onus of the institution where they're supposed to write down, this is what we need to operate within the system. But I always say it's hard to know because it's almost like moving from like Earth to Mars. And you think sometimes people get tied into the details of like, well, in Earth, we got to water our plants, every day. And maybe it's like, well, you're not going to have plants. So you don't need to write down that that's no longer a task to write. But even if you make it iterative and you write it down as a first draft, but all these things, like people don't think about, well, how's campus safety going to be able to look up students? And probably in their
Hmm.
legacy system, it was like a report from a data warehouse, but now the data warehouse is gone, but no one really thought about like, well, how are they going to get the information? Whereas it makes sense. Well, Workday goes down on Friday nights. Well, that's when a lot of parties happen. So maybe like what's going to be that interface? So for my company, so we have Workday student expertise, but we really look at a school's entire technology stack to say, in order to achieve your operations, what do you need to do and what's going to be the best tool to get there. So implementation partners are going to be just focused on Workday. Like that's what they've been hired. They're not like, well, maybe you could use your Slate instance for this instead. And that's what it's gonna be like, well, you have to go figure that out on your own. Or what would be the best way to do ID management within the system? And I am not an ID management expert, but I highly recommend schools to bring that in so that you can really think about the flow of your data and your systems. um, there's also just things that we do around just that hands-on support. So most post-production support partners use a ticketing system. That can be hard when it's like, this student can't register now. And this is,
Yeah.
early in the mornings. It's hard to get that kind of on-call support and for to have the same person that knows your system in and out, knows your culture, that you're not like, we have these programs of study. So, but it's not like something that necessarily, like you said before, that they need these roles forever, but when you're stabilizing in the system, you just need that extra help to kind of get by. And so to have someone on call that's available to be like, yep, I'm going to block my morning so that I can just be here and they don't have to teach us anything because we've been there along the way. It's all on demand. So there's no commitments that we make schools made. We don't say, okay, you're going to pay for 200 hours and like we're going to charge you. It's just like we're going to have 200 hours approved. And if you need it, you need it. If you don't, you don't. But all the
Yeah, you don't
value that
pay.
we deliver, it makes them say, we got to keep working with you because wow, like this is getting us to that next level. And I think just the focus, at least in the Workday ecosystem, there's just not, it's still growing, but the focus is still on implementation and there isn't that same focus on especially that stabilization period.
Yeah, it makes so much sense because those implementation partners, as you said, they're focused on Workday, on implementing Workday only. And it seems like, especially with your experience coming from faculties and institutions, you can think on a bigger scale, bigger picture. So yes, you can implement Workday. Yes, you can optimize it, but you also think about everything else that matters to universities. So I think it's pretty powerful. What do you feel about being too niche down? Because I've had many Workday consultants. They try to stuff their resumes with all of those modules and those expertise. And to be fair, you can only have like one or two, maybe three expertise in Workday, like true expertise, right? But in your case, you're like student, and student is just for institutions. Like, how do you manage that, or how do you feel about it, even in the future for future contracts?
So I give credit to Moran Technology Consulting, who really predicted that, like I said, every institution is going to have to change their student information system. So most schools implemented a student information system in the 90s or early 2000s because when
Hmm.
computers were coming about, so they all implemented at the same time. And they've all been using, for the most part, the same system because none of the vendors out there really came out with something. None of them moved to the cloud. Um, and I think it's just at a point that even if they move to the cloud, it's still going to be like a complete transformation. And that's where they
Yeah.
end up looking. Right now, Workday's, leading the market. It's been out there with the cloud product for the longest. A lot of times the institutions do use the HCM and finance, and it's like, well, this could make a lot of sense to stay within one product. At this point, I think there's going to be a lot of continued moves. I mean, a lot of bigger schools are getting into Workday Student, and that's really exciting
Yeah.
because it started out with just a lot of smaller schools. The other thing is that I don't feel like I'm limited to Workday Student. Again, I look at this whole school's technology stack. So I would also work with
It's
schools to
true.
do a student information or ERP assessment. That's something
Yeah.
that I love to do. I love doing planning work. I can't believe I haven't talked about this, but like I feel like it's the whole thing, like really 2 years before you start the move, that's when you can make the impact. I compare it to like making a move if you were moving into a different home. And the
Hmm.
thing that's going to make your move go the smoothest is all the work you do before the movers show up there. All the organizing, be like, we don't need this anymore. Like measuring, the home you're going to move into to be like, yep, this is where the couch should go. But you plan it out and all that decluttering, all that really for in terms of student, I like to say map out your processes. A lot of times offices have been working in silos. So especially you've been on this computer, system for 20 plus years, and a lot of times they weren't that integrated. Workday's heavily integrated, not only within the
Hmm.
student product, but with HCM, within finance. So now you have a lot more communication that you need to do. In order to do that, you need to map out what you've done. A lot of time higher ed doesn't invest in documentation of saying this is how this process is going to work, or it's very written to their system. Well, in this, you're going to go to this key and then you're going to press this, and it's not high level. So I love working with schools to help them map out what are all their processes. Um, and I would also say, I'm like, say every school transitions to the new student information system. In my experience with these legacy systems, you still have that need for independent consultants that help you to
Hmm.
say, I'm trying to problem solve this. It's just a different kind of project than what you would do for like post production support. It's not like just truly a ticket, it's more like projects or like, hey, we need advice on this. And it's an ongoing relationship. A higher ed is very relationship focused. And so to have someone that knows your institution, that just continues to support them, you don't have to teach. I think for many things, and not always, sometimes you want that technical knowledge of the implementation partner and who's got all that access and they're working on these things. But other times it's more like the biggest need is already knowing the school.
It seems like there's so much that you do for universities. You're not logging into the tenant every day, right? Like your job is even broader than that, it seems.
No, I am logging into the tenant every day.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, nice. Okay. Okay, cool. So strategy and even, configuration, tenant, etc. So a mix of both. But I like how, even as an independent or business owner, I like how you're not just limited to Workday. There's so many other services that you can help your clients with. And I think that's one of the main competitive advantage that you're having right now.
Yeah, and it's something where I know there's people that I'm like, oh, I would really love to work with them. And I think we've got this vision of trying to help higher education along. Higher education has got a lot of tough situations with declining enrollment, but I just call it like a high administrative cost. And I don't know if you see this in like the HCM finance side, but I'm like, it's where they've got processes that just they take a lot of time and money, and exceptions are kind of like someone I heard say recently, exceptions are expensive.
Yeah.
And really, when you're dealing with a tough budget situation, to say, is that where we want to spend our money? Do we really want to have this complicated of a satisfactory academic progress policy? Or could we find a way to streamline this? What are our desired outcomes? Like, what was the point of this? And we might need to throw this, out the window. And I think that's where my team and I, we are good at facilitating that discussion because we all come from higher ed. We all been in
Yeah.
those shoes. It is something of that lived experience that helps, but discussion facilitators, you don't often think about that in like the Workday ecosystem, but I have found that skill to be so valuable in that like translating between different people and trying to draw out this is what you actually want. Okay, then maybe I'm going to even go translate that back to your partner to say this is what
Hmm.
they're trying to communicate, so they can get to that. But people are tied into the details. And I even found that when I worked in career services, people would give me their cover letter and it's like 2 pages is telling their whole life story. I put it down. I'm like, tell me the top 3 reasons that they should hire you for this job and give me in 3 sentences. And they could do it. And I was like, okay, that's what we're putting in this paper. And so that kind of translation of like helping schools to say,
Hmm.
what are you trying to do here? Okay, now let's back out of all these details and find a better way, more efficient that doesn't cost so much money. Because if it takes a lot of staff time, that's costing the institution money. And we need to be aware of that. It's often not thought about.
No, I like that. I'm putting myself in the shoes of someone in an institution implementing Workday, just listening to this episode, and it's so many nuggets. So I appreciate that. What are the main top mistakes that institutions make while implementing Workday? If you think of top three.
I think when the top three is not looking at downstream impact. So because you're going through this configuration checklist and you're kind of being introduced to one thing, but maybe your implementation tenant doesn't have all the downstream effects. So for example, you configure grades in it, but you don't have the setup to actually do registration and support grading. And so
Yeah.
you haven't gotten to that configuration task. But how do you know if your grading scheme works because you can't actually see it in action? And I think an easy idea is you take in student, it's not it's the AMU tenant, the
Hmm.
alma mater university tenant
Oh
that
yeah,
they
yeah,
get
yeah.
access to. And I'm
Hmm.
say you have to suspend reality a little bit because maybe they don't have your exact GPA, maybe it's not configured right, but like put in a couple of your own grading scheme. It might feel like extra work, but it's not. It is saving you time if you can see how that GPA is going to end up being calculated. Because Workday is a translation, again, going from Earth to Mars. It's going to work differently. And I think people assume like, oh yeah, these are basically the same. It's not. It works very differently. And so understanding what does this field mean? Maybe another thing is like they do testing, but I feel like testing doesn't help you understand fully what you need to do. You need to do science experiments. So you need to have our data experience. I was a political science major. I'm like, you need to have a hypothesis. I
Yeah.
hypothesize if I configure my grading scheme like this and I give this grade, then I think this should be the result. And you test it. But I think they'll just say, well, that's what we learned from our implementation partners was, so I gave these things back, but you don't go through the science, sort of like science experiments to like constant. I'm still doing hypotheses every day that I'm like, I think this is how it works. And I'll go to the documentation. I'm like, maybe, but you have to, like, it's beyond testing, which feels more simplistic to me, but it's constantly having hypothesis.
Going back to your hypothesis statement, you you can't possibly know everything from from your head, right? So, as consultants, even if we're considered experts, even if we're coming as experts as architects, we need to make a hypothesis and statements and just testing them out and see how it goes. But that was the number one mistake. What's the two others?
Yeah, so not doing the planning work in
Yeah.
advance. I think people feel like, oh, well, I want to wait until my implementation partner shows up and I see a plan stage in the timeline. What they don't realize, I think for me, a lot, maybe one frustration I have with the Workday methodology is it's very much written in Workday centric language and not the customer. So
Ah,
there's
that's
even
true.
things like customer
Ah,
confirmation session. I had someone at
yeah.
the institution I work with that was like, Workday doesn't know we're a customer yet. Um, but there's things as the organization implementing, you just rebrand it to be like this is the concept. So I'd call it this is our Workday sharing session. Great.
Oh,
We're going to share
nice.
like what's been configured and now people understand why they're coming to the meeting because if you send out a meeting invite and someone's not involved in the project and they see a customer confirmation session, they have no idea what they're getting into. The
Hmm.
agenda usually is broad and they're not understanding the point. So maybe that's even the third is like trying to get to that big picture. I think they
Yeah.
live in the details and not understanding what's the plan. The amount of people that don't understand the timeline is incredible to me. It is very complex. So I like to revisualize the timeline. I can't tell you how many times I've seen transformation by just this, where people are like, oh, now I understand the expectation of me and when I need to have things done. They often, because it's these rolling uptakes, it looks like the timeline's like 9 months longer than what it actually is. And when you're like, oh no, it all has to be done back here by the move to production too. They're like, what? You build up all this anxiety, but I think knowing a lot of people working on this, they've never done that. I'm like, even when I had done multiple implementations and I'm like moved to production too, okay, but I see the graduation doesn't happen for another 9 months. So I don't need
Yeah.
this to be ready for another 9 months after that move to production too. It's like, oh no, that's when the implementation partner is not really going to be here that much anymore after they do that build for you. And then you're sort of on your own, which again, you could get independence to help you. There's some philosophies that I have around what needs to be at 100% ready, what needs to be at like maybe that 90%, 80%, 75%, but like there's some things that if you're not going to do something for 9 months, if you get it to that 75% level, that's probably good enough. It's too
Yeah.
much to ask for everything to be at 100%. So set realistic expectations and then have your own project timeline of like, okay, we're going to come back to this in the summer and we're still going to be months ahead, but we got enough out of it to be able to feel confident and we're going to focus our energies on those things that we're going to uptake immediately, which in Workday Student is the registration. Everything's targeted towards a single academic period. So it's not this calendar year and like everything turns on. So it's if this is registration for fall, if it's admitting students for the fall, if it's packaging financial aid for the fall, then all that's going to be done. But all the things for like that summer, that's still in your legacy system. So it's like this, it's a complicated dance, but I'm like, it's a massive system being used across so many offices, so many constituents at an institution.
Yeah.
You really have to plan for it, but like constantly trying to aim for 100% on 100% on integrations, 100% on all the configuration tasks is too much.
Is this something you help your clients with, like scoping, like what should be 100%, what should be 75%, etc.? Do you help them with that? Yeah.
Yes, and it's really based on, I guess if there was something that's like, hey, the implementation part we're going with a super complicated graduation process, we really need to make sure that this is good, then you have to, whatever that percentage is, yeah, it's going to adapt, but I would say typically it's going to be based on an uptake of the functionality, um, but helping them to prioritize. So, and I've heard this from so many HCM and finance implementations too, of like too complex of BPs. And I think when
Mm,
you're going through the implementation part, and it's like, okay, tell us about your, like, what you want for your change of major process. And like, oh, this is what we've been dreaming about. But they're on a paper form right now. And to say, well, are we going to have the staff to support this complicated BP? Because now when a student can't change their major, we need someone that has skills to problem solve a BP, a business process, which is a thing in Workday. And those staff that process the paper applications, that is not a realistic expectation that they're going to be able to
Yeah.
do this complex. So you have to think about staffing, but a lot of times during the implementation, that's not, it's the time of like, this is, we're going to design it for what we want. So trying to say like, well, we still can aim for that. And it's like, okay, we're going to save that. But for now, we got to stick with more initiate complete. Maybe we're going to stick with the paper process for the initial launch because we got so much change going on. And it's kind of in higher ed, it's getting that staffing in place. That's some of the
Hmm.
most complex pieces, but also managing the change. I really look to Wellesley College, and they've done many presentations at Rising about how they implemented Workday Student. And it was very structured as to like making sure they didn't overwhelm the campus with change, but they constantly, when I've seen them present at Rising, it's like, okay, this is where we're at. This is, they keep making improvements, but like this is our
Yeah.
1 year plan, this is our 2 year, this is our 5 year. They're constantly looking out to the future, but it's again a sustainable pace. They can keep up with staffing, not take on too much. I think just people often, it's presented as just do it all now, and that's not feasible.
What timeline did they choose? Like, when did they start actually implementing, and then when did they go live?
It was, I think, about an 18-month time. I was not on that
18
project,
months?
but there were
Oh.
things that they kept with their legacy. So they didn't pick up using when Workday was called the advising functionality. So to say, in order to graduate with this major, you have to have completed these academic requirements. Workday
Oh,
had
yeah.
functionality. They opted to stick with, but they had really specific requirements. So they opted to stick with some of their existing systems and then strategically say, okay, now we're going to uptake the advising functionality. And I think it's got to be different for each institution, but each institution's got to say, what kind of people do we have? What are we willing to invest? I mean, if you're willing to hire, a massive independent contractor or consultant team that can be your on-call expertise for those years, then maybe that's a possibility. But you're not going to be able to get trained staff in that time, and there's some things that you just don't know how they work until you have live transactions. And
Yeah.
so there's got to be, it's a phrase that I often say to schools is in order to say yes to something, you got to be able to say no to something else. So helping them to figure out what are you going to say or no or not at this time, but we're going to get it on the schedule. Because a big shift from Workday to from the legacy system to Workday is people feel like if we don't do it now, it's never going to happen. And Workday's
Hmm.
not like that at all. It's very configurable. You can definitely adjust it. And you're going to have capacity once you kind of get through the stabilization period. So you have to leave that old mindset of like, if we don't do it now, it will never happen, to say, let's pace out the change. We're going to put that on the roadmap, and this is when it's going to roll out, and then it's going to go well when that does roll out.
You just need the right experts, like you said, the right independence. You know, Christina, I'm actually starting a higher ed project very soon, and I'm definitely gonna send this episode to them. There was so much value that you shared, especially best practices and your specific approach. If an institution, watches this episode and they're interested in reaching out, how can they contact you or find you online?
Sure. So on my website, legatostrategic.com, there's a lot of information there. There's the About Us. You can get in touch. I'm on LinkedIn. Happy, send me a direct message there. Um, and I am, I think, the only Kristina Kelpe in the world with this spelling. So it's also pretty easy to find me that way if you can spell Kelpe with Kelpe and it's Kristina with a K.
Yeah, I'll leave all the relevant links in the description of this episode anyway, so that they can find you pretty easily. But I think you described it very well. Any last thoughts before we leave this episode?
So the biggest thought is strategy is important. Strategy needs to be there. Ask the questions that you feel need to be answered and don't move away from those. Don't say, oh, I must not get it. If everyone just keeps asking, and I guess the one last thing is talking to peers. There's enough schools that have gone live with Workday Student now, so much advice that they're willing to share. And I'd say don't just talk to the CIO, they're really in that big picture. Talk to some of the hands-on people. The registrar is the hub of the academic record, is literally the hub of all of Workday Student. It comes to like talk to the registrar, talk to the director of financial aid, the bursar. Those are people that can give you really good advice. from their experience.
I think my main takeaway from this call is really just like you said, your overall philosophy. I think implementing Workday is just one small piece among like many strategies where you need to spend most of your time. I think I remember your analogy to moving. I think I love that. I imagined it instantly. And then even after Workday, there's so many intersections and connections to other systems that university needs to take into account. So really appreciate you, Kristina, sharing your experience with institutions. And I hope to have you for a second episode, maybe when you have other strategies to share with more experience. But I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.